Hey, hello everyone. Welcome to the Cartographer office hours for today, December 6th. And yeah, 6th, that's correct. So let's get started. Let me share my screen. And there you go. Remember, and especially for folks out there watching the recording, the goal of this meeting is twofold. First, to try to have a more dedicated space to answer questions from the community, technical questions, how to use Cartographer for specific use cases, and also how to extend the project and propose ideas or discuss ideas that eventually could extend the how or the base use cases of the tool, or how things are done currently, right? So the first thing is to decide who could serve or help with note taking.
I can
So
do that
if
today.
there's, thank you, because I have a wheel of names, but thank you, Emily. There we go. Okay, and first one, I'm if I don't remember right, it was proposed by Oshima. I don't remember right, but it was went to RFC, went not to RFC, and it's a really good one.
I actually think this came up from Sam from a different meeting, but I think the only criteria we have right now is if it's a breaking change, we require an RFC. But besides that, we don't have any other guidelines. So I was wondering if there are other guidelines we should be following.
Can I propose a maybe not radical, but maybe a different way of thinking about RFCs? I think every change should be covered by an RFC, but an RFC could be really wide and cover a lot of future work, if that makes sense. So instead of thinking about it like, does this particular change require, more visibility? Could we think about it like, is this change covered by an RFC that was already proposed, or is it something that's new and needs to get put in front of the community first to get consensus on? And then might encourage you to, instead of making really narrow RFCs that not everybody cares about, kind of making larger RFCs that cover more of the vision for the future you want to create, and then deciding whether the smaller pieces of that need subsequent follow-ups. That way, like all the design decisions kind of get made in public and reviewed. That's how it works on Cloud Native Build Packs, at least for the other project I'm involved in.
I think that makes sense. I think this originally came out of Sam's work on surface counts that he's been working on a lot, and there was no RFC around that.
Sorry.
Oh, I don't mind trying that out, Sam or Stephen, but I don't know what the rest of the team thinks.
I have an immediate gut reaction, which is one of being more in control. So I think it comes down to, when I hear that, I'm like, oh, so like a classic example, it turns out there's an RFC for this, which is down there. I think it's 14 or 12. There's an RFC that talks about observation, right? And it covers some of the things that we could share about parameters. And I was just thinking it'd be a great idea, and it's not hurting anyone if I was to put in the status and observe like what's available as a parameter to the next person. Basically, that's the idea, right? And the specifics of that is present some observability about what parameters are available. But the broader general RFC that I'd have to generate before I started that work would be an RFC on being able, having good observability into the system. And it's a great story, and it's one I'd love to write something up about, but probably I'm used to incrementing from the other direction. Well, what if I add this? And what if I add this? Does this start to build up something, right? Rather than something that feels a lot more waterfall-like, which is what a general RFC sort of feels like. because RFCs tend to need to be more specific than use cases, right? They tend to need to also include a likely implementation. Or is there some way we can deal with that, where we give the use case and then likely implementations, and before we even ratify the RFC, we try some?
I don't think an RFC has to include implementation. Like it's really just a request for comments about anything, if that makes sense. And the question is kind of like, how can you use that format for like requesting feedback on a proposal from a lot of people to drive progress in the project? And so if you have something that you want to work on more iteratively, could that be a bunch of small, kind of easy to put together RFCs that work towards a direction, or a higher level RFC that says, I think we should move in this direction in general, and I'm going to work on some small parts. What do folks think about that, right? It shouldn't dictate how you kind of work forward and make progress. It's just communicating that you're going to do that, if that makes sense, with whatever granularity that you want to use as a tool to be able to move forward in that way. Does that make sense? So like if you want to work on something where you're not sure where the end goal is, but just capture that in an RFC that says, this is where I think we should be in some amount of time, or here are a few places we could be, and I'm going to work towards it here. And then maybe some smaller RFCs if you feel like you need reviews on the individual pieces. Maybe not. Chat with your team and figure out what people agree with.
I'm used to IETF style RFCs. That's when people talk about RFCs, that's what I'm thinking of. And they're invariably specs before they ever get written. So I guess that's where I come from habitually, right?
Yeah, I think other kinds of projects have like, Kubernetes has a CAP, Python has a PEP, right? Like they have different ways of proposing, new changes that they don't necessarily call RFCs, but they're, in a sense, the same kind of process, right? If we need a better name for it, because we feel like it implies too much IETF.
No, that's fine. No, I'm just observing the historical context or baggage that I walk in with, right? Which is I've always assumed that invariably in the IETF, if you want to find out what tag, what state of a protocol, anything like that, you go and look at the RFC, and that is canonical to what actually got implemented, right? So I think I just bring that baggage along. I think other people might too, but they may not. We may just want to be clear about it. All right.
So maybe we can try and capture this in our contributing and flesh that out a little bit.
I wonder if there's an example of people using RFCs for this higher level thing, Stephen, that has a contributing description for it that we can already just copy.
Yeah, Cloud Native Build Packs their RFCs aren't intended to be specification. The project actually has a separate specification that does use formal, RFC 3339 language that's different from their RFC process, which is just a proposal process, if that makes sense. So you could borrow language from that if you wanted to.
That might be good.
Something I often like is when a project takes the time and effort to outline what their first principles are, in terms of like, these are the things that are core to the design of the way that we're building the project. And any future decision always gets easier to review in the context of those principles. So like, as long as you agree that like, okay, Cartographer is going to be choreography, then you can judge everything else down the line about, okay, is this choreography, at least however we define choreography, just as to toss a single example out. But then those principles can be extremely broad or sort of more specific to a domain, depending on what you're actually trying to achieve. Like the broad principles often end up being more useful because they're more likely to stand the test of time over change, as opposed to specifics will likely evolve. Like how service accounts work today will likely be different than how they work tomorrow. It's different than how they worked yesterday.
I think we're pushing pretty hard at the moment to get those broad principles in. We're trying to get a positioning statement done into our docs, and we're doing an architecture sweep, just to basic outline of architecture and the orientation behind that, which again, highest, not the highest level, but a high level, without getting into the nitty gritty. So that's coming. So it's good that you say that, because we felt like that was important and we're doing some of it. So that's some alignment.
Cool. I think that's enough on RFCs then, probably.
So it looks like we can move to the next item. I have this open here.
This is just one example. But the topic as a whole, I think, came out of something we talked about in a meeting last week about just our informers have started to have to do a lot of the work the controller does, like matching workloads and deliverables to supply chains and deliveries in order to know which workloads need to re-reconcile on a change to a supply chain, for instance. And now when like a service account changes, has to know which workload is using that service account to re-reconcile, to enforce that one to re-reconcile. And that means it has to know all the cascading logic of like, if the workload specifies a service account, follow that one. If it doesn't, then if it's specified in the supply chain that matches it, and that's the service account that changed, then reconcile the workload. And if not, go back to the default service account. And so it's a lot of controller logic that feels like it doesn't really belong in the informers, but I also don't have a better solution. And I was wondering what people thought, like maybe that's the way it's supposed to be, but felt awkward.
I feel core to this, I think you've mentioned this before, there is a sense that this is knowledge that could already be established, maybe even in memory, all right, about how things relate. But one of the nice things about the design you have right now is it's entirely reentrant, and state is not something that has to be established through the reconciles of the existing objects. It's just as it comes. Every object will reinstate. What I think I'm saying is that I like this particularly because it feels like a MapReduce over a data set, over a normalized data set, which is the records that sit on etcd, right? However, I wonder if there are parts of this that could be broader and cause reconciles that maybe we have more reconciles, so that some of that logic, especially the ones about making default decisions, falls back into the fact we have more reconciles and we exit the reconcile as early as we can, so that we limit informers to just mappings that are not
related to our CRDs, basically.
Yeah, to structure rather than to logic. Yeah, structural decisions about which things to inform against versus logical ones. So it would, I don't have explicit examples, but you might be able to glean one from it. Whatever you're doing to say, oh, it's this or that I need to be looking at, if it could possibly trigger a reconcile of a workload or a supply chain, then just say, go and reconcile it and see how we do. I don't think we have any early efficiency requirements to make sure that we're not running the reconcile too often.
So you're saying we're okay with re-reconciling workloads unnecessarily?
We might be. I think the reason I prefer this specific approach is that it should be entirely easy to rationalize about the events that we see on the API server. And that makes it easier for us to rationalize what's actually going on. One of the problems we've had during testing, for example, especially when we just did retries and backoffs, was it was very hard for us to work out what cause, and whether we actually fixed a problem or we just hadn't waited long enough for backoff not to be the thing that was solving it. All right. If you don't wait long enough for backoff to go to like a minute, and then you try something, it should resolve in a few seconds. And if it doesn't, then you know, oh, that's bad. So we, you know, to prove that, we had to get back off out of the story, which meant we also made it much more efficient at the same time.
I think what, oh, sorry, Scott, go
Yeah.
ahead.
Scott, please.
Yeah, I was just gonna share what I've used in the past that's worked fairly well. If someone else has something tactically to respond to, Rashad, go ahead. I'm not hearing anybody. So like, I think what I heard the problem is that you basically have these two parallel sets of logic where you're kind of duplicating some of the business logic in terms of understanding the relationships between resources. I see some nods. Okay.
Yeah, that sounds right.
I mean, fundamentally, the reconciler is the authoritative source of what resources are relevant to a particular resource that's being reconciled. So it's basically in the reconciler, if you look up a specific resource to do something with it, then that state is meaningful. Or if you need some state to reflect back onto your status, then like that resource is meaningful. And the pattern I've used in the past, which has worked fairly well, is to basically define for a particular resource, what resources do you want to track? And then whenever one of those resources gets nicked and get the informer event, then basically do that reverse mapping and then figure out, okay, here are all the resources that we're tracking that resource, and then enqueue them into the work queue for the reconcile event process. So effectively what that means is that in your controller logic or in your reconciler, you can basically say, track this resource, track that resource, track this third resource. And you can basically do it in line with your logic. So the same place where your reconciler is looking up that resource to be able to say, this is what I need in order to do something, you can also do that tracking and sort of establish that relationship.
Can I get some clarity on what you mean by,
sure,
by track that resource? Currently, we track a kind.
Mm-hmm.
We do not track any details about which one it is. Is that what you're suggesting? That maybe you go further and track which resource specifically you care about, put it in something that the mapper can then reverse later? Yeah,
so it could be anything that makes sense for you specifically or for the project. Like in my experience, like I actually created, and actually this is even like cribbed from work that happened in Knative. They actually have a tracker object that is sort of maintaining that relationship and the inverse.
We use that one.
Okay.
That one, oh no, it's not the Knative one, is it, Emily?
I forget where we get it
We're using one that
from.
makes sure we don't duplicate tracks of kinds.
The dynamic
Yeah,
wherever we
yeah.
pulled that from.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's also something called a object tracker from Client Go that's a little bit different. But like aside from the specifics of the implementation, like the general pattern is that you can basically define the objects that you care about as part of your main reconcile loop, and then sort of use that to sort of create that in-memory mapping of what are the resources that you care about for this other specific resource, so that when you get those informer events, it's basically just a map lookup rather than actually executing business logic.
Yeah, we've talked about doing that in the past. I think that's what KPAC does. That's what, yeah, I think I brought that up in the past, and it's definitely a little tricky here because like in our instance, like for example, if a service account is defined in the workload, so we're going to want to reconcile on changes to that service account. But we also now want to reconcile on any change to roles or role bindings that affect that service account. And those aren't immediately known in the reconcile loop, right? You'd have like, it doesn't feel like that's the place to like, it feels weird to like in that instance, go and look up all the roles and role bindings that might affect it. And also if new ones are created, like a new role binding is created, that would affect the service account. You wouldn't learn about that. And so it feels like we would need some sort of mix of what we have now and what you're describing.
I'm going to just suggest that the reconciler loop is actually a better place to do that lookup, because those lookups have the possibility of failure. And if that lookup fails, then in the reconcile loop, you have the queue, and it will basically reschedule that turn or that event or that request to be processed again.
But you still wouldn't learn about
So
a
you can
new
handle-
role, right? Like a new role binding or a new role would never affect it, would never cause a reconcile.
Yeah,
that
I mean, you could
instance.
also say, like, I'm not sure I would ever recommend this, but like you could set up an informer for all roles and role bindings.
That's what we have
And
now.
then, and then in that, just check to see, okay, does this map, like instead of having the tracker be specifically for resource A to resource B, you can basically have it be, I want to know when this resource references a service account that is referenced that then maps to a word. So like you could put some
Right,
more
yeah.
logic in
That's
there.
what I meant by that combination of like what you're describing and what we end up with, what we have right now, essentially. But
I
yeah,
mean, the other option is just, if you don't have RBAC permission, let the resource fail and just let it be rescheduled normally.
I was going to ask,
Which-
what's the advantage of tracking all the roles and role bindings? Is it so that when users create new roles and role bindings that suddenly fix something, it fixes quickly?
you
Or
don't
is
have to
it,
reapply your workload or anything like that.
and you don't want to rely on like just back off eventually it'll
Well,
Well,
back
yeah.
off, you might fix it after the back off period ends, then you're stuck.
Your back off gets longer and longer really quickly.
yeah.
But
yeah, yeah.
I think also we've had another principle apply. Sorry, Marty, we'll do our best. Another principle that we've been trying to use is not to end up in back off when it's something that requires user interaction anyway. Again, that was just so that we could predict it. I don't know whether other people agree with that. It just felt right for us. So we go into back off when there are exceptions or network partitions and those sorts of things. Those are things that we can resolve. And so it just seemed logical that you would try to resolve all of the other possible problems. It's understandable why you would think the roles stuff might be less. So how did you get that wrong? But
The other danger there is that the RBAC resources are not the authoritative source of permissions within the cluster. And there are other ways of making access control decisions that you won't have visibility into. So like you still have to handle the case where all of a sudden you do have permission. There's no resource to watch to know that you now have permission.
okay. I think that doesn't remove the, I mean, we might just be able to lighten this up with something more ostensibly, something that's just more like user facing. Look, if you don't have it right by the time a developer is using workloads, then they're not going to work and they're going to have to reapply them. And if you do anything to break them in the meantime, they'll also end up with a problem where they have to reapply their workloads to get anything to happen. And that's not the worst thing in the world.
Could you not back off to a really long polling interval on permissions issues? And that way eventually they get corrected regardless of how the permission thing happens, but still back off to it on other kinds
That
of issues.
works. That works. Because we do have I don't think you can back off with controller runtime. I think you can just specify a long poll, right?
You can specify how long you want to wait.
Yeah, which is different from back off, right? It doesn't do anything
Yeah,
exponential. It's
because
just
at
saying we're
that
going to
point you're not returning an error at that point. You're returning result with a
timeout or whatever
different
it's called.
interval. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder, Scott, is that, I think you've written more controllers here than a lot of people. Is that a pattern you've seen before?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
I like that
So,
one
I mean,
over.
that's typically how I've implemented polling.
Yeah.
Is basically just instead of returning the result being empty, which basically means everything was good, wait for some new trigger.
I mean,
you can return a result with like a retry. I think it's retry after.
I mean, on permissions errors, specifically, is that a pattern you've seen?
No, but it seems reasonable to me.
We could make it very clear too. This is a specific return result. Make it obvious that it's named for the other developers. I mean, not for the users, but for other developers, and say, actually, we do intend on implementing a back off status as well, because we feel it's something worth telling users as well. And so we can tell them that we're in back off because of a partition or in back off because of permissions issue. I think that helps everyone, right? And what it also leaves us with is a simpler map reduce, because it wasn't that bad before the RBAC stuff. So a simpler map reduce for our watches that don't end up with an in-memory graph that then becomes hard to invalidate. I mean, personally, I just think it's easier to think about state of the world, map reduce it. It'd be expensive if it wasn't for the fact that the client is caching, right? But it is, so it seems like the quick way to do things at this point. I really
It certainly
appreciate
helps our
feedback, Scott.
integration tests
Yeah,
that we need to write. So I think that's what we wanted to hear.
thanks for coming, Scott. It's helpful.
I got it up a little early. Thanks, everybody.
See you. So basically, we're going to rip out the informers around RBAC, implement some sort of long polling period for permissions issues, or eventually hit back off.
Long polling, I think that makes sense.
And yeah, get that information to the user.
I can share code for places where I've done this in the past,
That would be great.
or at least parts of it.
Rip out RBAC. I just want to capture this. Rip out RBAC informers, basically.
Informers, yeah.
And set up polling for permission issues.
Let's call it long polling just for clarity.
Okay.
And you also said, and inform users. I think as a part of whatever that work is, we should actually just have a status that just says that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're in the long poll for, yeah. I think that could just go on the condition that says that we don't have the permissions required. Oh, see you, James.
Cool. Yeah, those would that have been a question, Scott, like we could have thrown in the controller runtime channel and that would have been picked up, or
Certainly it would be, or I think it's QBuilder is the name of the channel, which encompasses controller runtime.
okay.
You would certainly find people there with opinions. Often times, like, you'll find a lot of opinions on some things, or you'll either get no response at all. But it's definitely a good place to try things.
Thank you, Scott, for your contributions. This is great. Any objection to the decision? Any comment? I don't think so. Cool. Yeah, next item, I think it was proposed by Washuma, but I don't see him on. So regarding how to update the RFC with the change, the RFC 14 with the changes discussed previously. So I don't know if anyone has a comment on this.
No.
I don't know what the issue is here, unfortunately. So I'd like to know. So maybe we can punt this to next week.
Yeah.
Because I'm
Yeah,
thinking that the issue here is, how do you work on an RFC that's in someone's pull request, which is coming off of another repository, right? And I think it might have to come down to, oh, now Washuma turns up because he heard me speaking in his name.
I thought we had talked about previously just creating a new RFC and taking ownership of it. Like Paul doesn't want it to own it.
Then Paul did get active on it. That's the thing. He then got active on it.
At the end of last week, the convo that we had was that Paul put in the use case, which is what we talked about during the during that earlier meeting, but he hadn't incorporated any of the changes that that had been discussed. And so the last thing that Josh had said about it was, yeah, we should just write an issue that supersedes that, and he wants that that he had talked to Paul directly, and Paul's okay with us taking that over and just keeping him up to date. Like, yeah, this thing's gotten taken care of.
So now it's who more than how.
I mean, I'm happy to rewrite this, and Mr. RFC.
Well, so what could we offer you here? Is there any answers you need here?
I guess just confirmation. My intention was to take the last thing that the last implementation that we talked about last week, which is detailed in the comments of the RFC, and just write those into the proposal. Make that RFC 17, and probably put a comment on here to say like, hey, RFC 17 is meant to supersede this. If you make a pull request, to just stick the word withdrawn on this. We'll continue forward with RFC 17.
We can't just pick it up as 14 and move it.
I mean, the RFC as it is points to Paul's repo, and the and it has like his name on it. Also, part of the thing that I want with the mark it withdrawn is that we then can merge this PR into our repo. We keep all that history, and then we'll just like put that in a folder. Like, these are withdrawn RFCs.
Okay. I think that we can do that. All of what you just said there, with keeping the 14 and keeping the PR history as well, and bring it to our repo and just point the PR to that. I believe that's possible. Maybe you and I can spend 5 seconds trying that before we bump another one. Unless anyone thinks I'm oversensitive to the idea that the RFCs change their ID for the same intent. That's the only thing I'm sensitive to. All right.
I would say it's just a number. I don't care, I guess. So like,
Okay.
But if someone feels strongly, look
Something
into
you could
it.
do is merge it as a draft and then just create new PRs against that same file.
Yeah, I mean, you can literally merge it into a branch locally, right? Instead of to main, you can say accept this PR into same name locally, right? Or same name on origin is what I really mean there. But whatever works for you. Whatever works for you. It's just I felt like keeping the number was more. I guess, Emily, the thing is that we end up talking about them, and I go 14 was that one about observability, right?
Yeah, I hear you. I mean,
It becomes my identity.
I don't even know what
says
it's about at the
17 and I
moment.
lose complete track. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally get that.
Yeah,
Trying to just hold the context.
Yeah, it's a worthwhile concern. Yeah.
Yeah, if you want to spend a couple minutes, and if it's not easy enough or it doesn't work out, then just move it. And I think that's totally fine.
Yeah, the mechanical Git stuff I think is totally doable.
Okay. Do you mind owning that, Washuma, trying to get that RFC taken over from Paul?
I don't mind, yeah.
Okay. I already wrote you down, so thank you.
Okay, anything else? Come and discuss? No? Okay, well, thank you so much for your time. So hope to see you next week for what will be the last office hours meeting of the year. You know what? Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Thank you, man.
See you then.